So now that I've talked a bit about the life cycle of a future and talked a bit about a human known use, let's take a look at Java futures. And we'll see that Java future is a generic interface that defines a number of methods. And we're going to talk about some of the key methods and understand how they can be applied in practice. We're going to be using the ActiveObject class from the upcoming EX16 case study as a running example when we talk about these different methods in the context of Java future and the Java future interface. So we're going to talk about the modern Java future API, or the modern Java future interface. Why that's important is because futures were added to Java way back in the day, back in 2004 with the release of Java 1.5. And in the intervening practically 20 years, they've been overhauled a little bit with the most recent versions of Java, Java 19, and very specifically Java 20, which came out quite recently in March of 2023 or so. So there's some new additional features added to Future. And if you read the link at the bottom of the slide, you'll learn why they did this. And it was basically to support something called structured concurrency. We're not going to be spending any time here on structured concurrency, but once you're aware of modern Java futures, some aspects of structured concurrency will be easier to understand. So a future provides a proxy to the result of an asynchronous computation. We've talked about that before. In particular, it defines a bunch of methods, and those methods do things like check to see if an asynchronous computation is complete or if it's canceled. If the computation needs to be canceled, there's an interface method that can cancel the computation. You can also wait for the computation, and you can also retrieve the result, if any, through waiting for the computation. And we'll see there's a couple of different ways to wait, one of which involves blocking, and then the other of which involves either polling or timed waiting. So let's talk a bit about how this works, and I'll start walking through the ActiveObject example from case study EX16 in just a little bit of detail. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of its implementation till a future upcoming lesson. Java methods can manage a task's lifecycle after it's been submitted to run asynchronously. So it can manage the creation and various states of the objects that are running asynchronously. It can also manage its destruction as well. As an example, the ActiveObject class that we're going to define is passed a function and a parameter to run asynchronously. And we do that by passing those in the constructor of ActiveObject from one thread, the main thread, to the ActiveObject that we're creating. And the function we're going to be using here is going to check to see if a number is prime. Once the ActiveObject has been started, a virtual thread will be created. And that, of course, will run the computation asynchronously using the features of virtual threading that we've talked about. Also, right after that, a future will be returned to the client. And in fact, the ActiveObject implements the future interface. So in fact, it is a future. So it's an is-a relationship that's enforced here. So when we create an ActiveObject, when the ActiveObject constructor returns, we now have a future in addition to having an ActiveObject. At that point, the ActiveObject can run the function it was passed as a parameter asynchronously in the background thread, which in this case is a virtual thread, but of course could be a platform thread if you so desired. That is easy to do as a slight extension. And then finally, there's a bunch of things you can do with the ActiveObject future from the client thread perspective. For example, you can test a future to see if it's completed, if it's done. And if it is, you can get its results right away. So you can say, if the future is done, then I want to take the results of that future and add them to some data structure, like a list, as we show here. You can also, in addition to checking to see if a future is done or not, you can see whether a future has been canceled. And if it has not been canceled and you want the computation to stop running, you can then cancel it. So here we're showing a little snippet of code that will cancel the computation via the future that we got back when we created the ActiveObject and started everything running asynchronously. So you can check to see if it's canceled, you can check to see if it's done, and you can cancel it if you need to. Likewise, if you decided that you don't want to cancel it, you can also use a future to retrieve the results of a two-way computation by blocking until the results are available. You can see here that the client thread will call the get method with no parameters on the future, which will block until the result is available. Now, we don't always want to block. So an alternative is to use a variant of get, which takes two parameters. The first is the amount of time to wait, and the second is the time unit to wait for, milliseconds, seconds, and so on. Here's an example where we're going to do a timed wait operation to be able to bound the amount of time we wait for the computation to be done. If you pass in a wait time of 0, it'll do a polling operation or a non-blocking check to see if the result is finished. And the semantics are slightly different. If you poll, then if there's no value, you get back a null. If you do a timed wait operation and the timeout elapses, then the timeout exception is thrown. Now, it turns out that there's other classes in Java and other frameworks in Java that build upon the Java future interface, the most relevant of which is the Java completable future class, which is something that forms the Java completable futures framework. And as you can see, completable future implements the Java future interface and defines many, many more methods and very powerful capabilities. We don't actually cover the Java completable futures framework in this course. It's covered in other courses. And I strongly recommend you take a look at that other material if you're interested in it. In particular, take a look at the link at the bottom of this slide to find out a lot more about the fascinating Java completable futures framework. So that's the end of the overview of Java futures.